The discussions will be at the end. Our second speaker is Stanley Mirvis, who is now at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The title of his talk is Entangled Allegiances, Channels of Communal Authority and Political Activism Among Caribbean-Sephardi Jews from 1692 to 1831.
Thank you very much. First of all, I like to begin with thank yous, and then from there move on to my apologies. And first, thank you to Professor Studzienski for including me in this panel, and also the organizers of the conference. And now my apologies. I'm going to give a slightly different paper, as you can see, than the one that's on the program. I want to focus specifically...
And you're going to speak about, between Crown and Assembly, the debate over Jewish taxation in Jamaica. Different years. Go.
Thank you that's much better. Thank you. Yeah, so there's a slightly different, a little change of program, but I want to focus specifically on Jamaica, on the issue of taxation between the crisis years of 1693 and the First Maroon War in 1733. And hopefully, I think that this will lead to a more nuanced understanding of the mechanics of political lobbying and political negotiation within the Western Sephardic diaspora, and this kind of focused more of a micro study. So first I'll say that Jamaica has been recognized by the first generation of researchers to be interested in colonial American history or in Caribbean Jewish history as something unique in the issue of taxation. So between 1909 and 1964, there were no fewer than 4 articles that came out in the publications of American Jewish Historical Society or the Transactions of the Jewish Historical Society of England that were very creatively titled something like The Jews' Tribute in Jamaica, The Taxation of Jews in Jamaica, The Taxation of Jews in 17th Century Jamaica, and Notes on the Jews' Tribute in Jamaica. So these were researchers that really had a very limited or no analytical interest. They were interested in collecting primary sources that were and presenting them sort of in isolation, maybe out of context, and so I decided to look at this material myself at the National Archives, just in hopes, National Archives of England, just in the hopes of even creating a coherent sequence of events, chronology of how the back and forth works between the colony and the metropole, how the negotiation works. And the first thing that really struck me was just how much of a constant negotiation this was over the issue of taxation in Jamaica. So clearly there's something unique about Jamaica and the taxation, and I'll just say that there was greater taxation in Jamaica than I think any other colony in the Americas. I'm aware of only one instance in Curacao when there was a tax levied on the Jews as such, Jewish tax. The only thing comparable, there is no Jewish tax in either Amsterdam or London in the metropole communities. And the only thing comparable is Barbados, which has a Jewish tax that comes up periodically. But it's far less than, it's probably half of what cumulatively was being paid by Jews in Jamaica. And also the Jews tax in Barbados had a slightly different flavor, literally, because it was usually paid up in sugar, as opposed to and currency, other currency. So as it was in Jamaica. So Jamaica, the question of why Jews in the colony are being taxed so much more than Jews in Europe, that's I think a point that merits further discussion. There's something different about the colonial world. Far from there was a title that came out in 1964 or 1960s. The title of the article was "The New World Sets an Example for the Old." How the Americas set a precedent for emancipation and civic liberty before they did in Europe, and I think that's something that we should probably revisit. And it came up yesterday too in the context of Brazil, that civil rights for former Conversos or the children of Conversos is not necessarily greater in the Americas than it is in Europe. So when you put it all together into a more coherent chronology of how the lobbying went back and forth, I think it starts to tell or lead to a more nuanced understanding of how the negotiation works in the Western Sephardic diaspora, and may help us to reassess what the relationship is between dependencies in the colony and the communities in Europe. What leads the colonies to go to Europe to lobby on their behalf for political rights. Okay, so before I get into the nitty-gritty of how the tax worked and how they lobbied, first I think we have to understand how the government works in Jamaica, and it's not a necessarily simple governmental system. The crown, starting in the 1670 in the Stuart Restoration, when there begins to be a more sustained policy of colonial policy, they appoint the Board of Trade and Plantation that was given the directive, the mandate to represent the crown's interest in the colonies. And part of their mandate is to appoint governors in Jamaica that were to be representatives of the crown. So the Board of Trade and Plantation that meets in London, they ultimately have the prerogative of governance in the colonies in Barbados or in Jamaica. And the governor, as such, is a representative of the crown, a crown appointed, in effect. The governor then has the right to appoint his own council. So there's a council in Jamaica that's appointed by the governor that's supposed to make sure that he's representing the interests of the crown. They have no legislative power at all. The governor in Jamaica has the right to declare war. He's the commander-in-chief of the militia. He has the prerogative of foreign affairs, but he has no legislative ability. So the governor cannot raise taxes or level taxes. And this is going to be important because the personalities of the governors do play an important role in determining how the Jews are going to, what course they're going to take in trying to lobby against the tax. The legislative branch in Jamaica is the House of Assembly. This is 32 representatives that are elected from 15 constituencies around Jamaica. Though well, I have a map of Jamaica too. Usually they only come from the St. Catherine region. This is a peculiarity in the electorate, in the system of election, which means that they're usually representing the interests of the planters. You can see here on this map the six Jewish settlements in Jamaica. So in the southeast is Port Royal on the peninsula. Across the harbor is Kingston, and then about 12 miles going west across the Rio Cobre is Spanish Town, which is the English capital. And if you head north to the other funny star in the north, that's Montego Bay, and then Lucia, and then south is Savannah Lamar. So there are Jewish communities in each of these places, three of which on the East Coast have synagogues, usually more than one. In some points there could be more than one. The funny thing, to go back to the governance in Jamaica, the funny thing about all this lobbying to the Board of Trade or to the Crown, it's sort of a mystery to me what the Jews or the representatives in Europe hope to achieve, really, since the governor has no ability to take a tax away, has no ability to cancel a tax. So the Board of Trade could give a directive to the governor, but still the governor his hands are completely tied to make any change. And the Jews never, as far as I can tell, never petitioned the House of Assembly themselves, directly. So that's a mystery about this whole thing that I don't have an answer to. I think that the only hope here is that the governor could leverage something or have influence over the decisions of the assembly, which in some cases did work, at least in the 1670s, where they were able to prevent attacks because of a governor that was incredibly sympathetic to the Jews at that point. It was Sir Thomas Lynch. So the very first tax that was issued against Jews or imposed on Jews in Jamaica occurs in the crisis period following the earthquake in 1692 that destroys Port Royal, followed by a fire that destroys Port Royal after that, and then a French invasion of the island that was very violent in the summer of 1694. So there was a pressing need for revenue, and the assembly raises a tax of 750 pounds on the Jews that was later followed 4 months later by an additional tax of 1,000 pounds. 1,000 pounds is about enough to buy 4 houses in Port Royal. So it's not a devastating amount, but it's not nothing either. They appoint. By the way, I'm going to put this into 3 different waves of taxation or phases of taxation as I see it.
Stan, that's for the community or the person?
Yeah, it's for the whole community. It's a whole community. They appoint 12 officials. Likely the members of the Ma'amad, we don't know because we have no internal records from Jamaica, so we don't know who the members of the Ma'amad are, but we assume that these 12 people that are appointed to collect the tax within the community. So that's 1,000 pounds for the whole community is not incredibly detrimental, really. And as soon as the tax is imposed in 1695 and then raised to 1,000 pounds, there is the first attempt to lobby against the tax, and this comes from the Jamaican Jewish community themselves, and they petitioned the governor, Sir William Beeston, a man who has a track record of anti-Jewish hostility, by the way, which is another story I don't have time to get into, but a really fascinating one. So it's clear that he at least saw the Jews as an easily exploitable minority from an earlier incident. That to me is quite clear, and even the Board of Trade accused him of being anti-Jewish at one point. So there was no sympathy from the governor here to influence the decision being taken by the assembly. And in the Jews' first attempt to petition against the tax themselves, we actually don't have the original text of the petition is not extant. We only know about it from William Beeston's correspondence to London, to the Board of Trade, where he tells us what the Jews' complaints were. They were complaining that they should be taxed at the same rate as everybody else. That's an obvious one. And also, the second major point was that the method of tax collection, having these 12 officials collected from the entire community, had become a point of contention in the community. And William Beeston writes that being a people without any governor, the Jews, or government cannot endure to be taxed by their equals, and there are consequently great quarrels and contentions among them. So that had been an issue, that there was some resentment in the community on this method of tax collection. Ultimately, that petition failed to produce results, as they all do, as we'll see pretty much. And then the next one comes from London. So what I'm interested in, is when do you stop petitioning yourself and go to your intermediaries in Europe? And so very soon after, the petition comes from London itself, from a London communal functionary named Antonio Gomez Serra, who petitions the Board of Trade in June of 1695, and he basically asked that Jews should be taxed at the same rate. He also says that Jews should be exempt from militia service on the Sabbath and on the holidays unless there be some pressing need. This didn't work. This didn't work either. He petitions the Board of Trade directly. And famously, following that, Don Manuel Belmonte, Baron Belmonte, and from Amsterdam, petitions the Board of Trade in 1699 in French, basically repeating the exact, even though this is a very celebrated event and kind of mysterious, why he's becoming why he's becoming entangled in an English matter is another mystery as well. But he basically repeats all the same arguments that Sarah had made earlier, adding only that the tax was incompatible with the Jewish status as free denizens. So really was nothing, really nothing that novel in his claim. And in fact, despite being so celebrated, immediately after the assembly receives the petition from Belmonte and from Europe, they decide to raise the tax by 1,500 pounds. So I don't know if that is a direct response or not. So the tax gets raised to 2,500 pounds following Belmonte's appeal. That's something that nobody ever tells you when they tell you about the Baron Belmonte appeal. Following that, Antonio Gomez Serra again tries to bypass the Board of Trade and go directly to Queen Anne. Maybe that will work. Let's go right to the crown. And that also fails. He only adds to this petition that the 12 Jews that are appointed to collect the tax are the only ones that actually can pay the tax, which is a claim that he makes, which is possible. It's just possible. That also doesn't produce results. And then finally, the last one seems to have had some effect, which is a petition by another London functionary named Ishak Pereira, who appealed directly to the Board of Trade, this time using mercantile arguments. Before they had been saying that that was in contradiction to indemnization. This time he says that we as London merchants can't trade with Jamaica when the Jews are being taxed beyond what other people are being taxed. And we don't know if it's because of this petition or not. Again, the Board of Trade has no legislative power in Jamaica, so it's hard to know what in the end reversed the tax. But eventually, by 1703, there is no more tax on record. And so between 1703 and 1718, this is a kind of quiet period, these 15 years where there is no Jewish taxation. Which is also interesting because when you read sort of popular or communal histories of Jamaica, you'll get a statement like the Jews were taxed always in Jamaica. And here's at least a 15-year gap in the tax. It's also the quietest, there's no major crisis between 1703 and 1718, which is the only time ever in Jamaican history until this very day that there is no major crisis. The crisis does come back. In 1718, under the governorship of Nicholas Laws, there is the island becomes incredibly divided. There's sort of extenuating circumstances. There's a resurgence of piracy in the north coast. There is the Maroon communities that had been in existence in the northeast of Jamaica since the conquest in 1655. These communities begin to skirmish and begin to raid plantations. So this becomes a major concern. And when you read the colonial correspondences, the issue that people are obsessed with in Jamaica is the growing black population that is engulfing the tiny white population in Jamaica, and they're passing laws in this period to try to encourage greater white settlement on plantations. Laws like for every 30 slaves you have to have at least 10 white people on your plantation. In line with these type of laws, the planters in Jamaica propose a new tax on the Jews to tax only Jewish merchants, but to exempt Jewish planters from a tax in order to encourage greater white settlement. Though that idea is completely rejected by the Board of Trade immediately as they get the petition. It's rejected. But more importantly here, and this is why I call the title of this piece is Between Crown and Assembly, is that there's a huge division between who has the right to raise taxes in Jamaica, who has the right for legislative power in Jamaica. And this is why the issue of Jewish taxation, I think, receives attention in the sources far beyond its actual significance. We're talking about very few Jews. Definitely less than 400 Jews. Maybe up to 500, 600 by 1730s. That's at the absolute most. We're not talking about a lot of money either. Yet the Board of Trade is almost obsessed with this issue. It's a constant negotiation. And I think it's because it's what it represents. It's symbolic that the assembly has the right to raise taxes, but that's against the interests of the Board of Trade, who want the Jewish mercantile activity in Jamaica. So always the Board of Trade is going to oppose a Jewish tax, and always the assembly is going to impose one. And so it becomes a divisive issue, and no more so than in these years between 1718 and 1729, when Nicholas Laws, the governor, has broad support for the Jewish community, and he is fighting the assembly over the right over who has the prerogative to tax the Jews. After this issue was debated in the assembly with the governor present, Nicholas Laws writes to the Board of Trade, says, writing, having in the last assembly proceedings seen so much stupidity, ignorance, and want of duty to the best of sovereigns, i.e. George I, that I'm almost fully convinced that the best way of bringing these people, the assembly members, to temper and to render the king's government here easy will be by settling the revenue at home, meaning by act of parliament in England. So he wants to completely take away the legislative power from the assembly. This was after debating the issue of a Jew's tax. So again, I think that the issue of Jews' tax is more of a symbolic issue than a serious concern for the Jamaican government. This time, there's only one appeal, and it comes directly from the Jamaican Jewish community. And this is a time when they have support from the governor. This is a time when they have support from the Board of Trade. There is no real reason to go to Europe or to rely on European intermediaries, which I think we'll come back to that, and I think that's important. And the only thing different in this appeal is that they refer back to their heroic defense of the island in 1694 when the French invaded as evidence that they shouldn't be taxed because we were also part of that defense of the island. The tax stood, though, and there was no repealing of the tax, and that leads us right into the third wave, which is the real crisis period. Oh, here's a picture. This is the peace treaty in 1740 following the First Maroon War. And really the First Maroon War is going to give us a lot of context for what's happening in this period. Like I said before, there had been constant skirmishes between the Maroon communities in the north and the colonial authorities in the south. And finally, by 1733, the war it becomes a real war, where the Maroons in the north in Portland get gunpowder and guns and firearms. And then now the Jamaican authorities are finally realizing that this is an all-out war. Compounded to that, two captured Maroons were tortured and interrogated, and under interrogation, they being asked, where did you get the gunpowder from? Where did you get the guns? They implicated a certain Jacob the Jew in Kingston who lives on Jew Street for supplying the gunpowder, which is a claim, whether true or not. It's a claim that's completely believed by the colonial authorities. So this time, the tax is obvious. They raise a tax because the island's at war. It's a major crisis. The militias in the north have completely fallen apart. But the Jews at this point have no leg to stand on, and as we'll see, the governor Edward Trelawney is very disinterested or kind of ambiguous about his position vis-a-vis the Jews tax. So I think that in the First Maroon War, the Jews have no choice but to rely on European intermediaries to lobby on their behalf, since they've been accused of being treasonous in Jamaica. It's not like they can really lobby the Board of Trade themselves. So the appeals all come from Europe. The first appeal in 1735 was from 95 English traders 95 signatories to a claim that they defended the Jews against the claim that they were in league with the insurrection, and they also repeated the old argument that we can't trade with Jamaica as long as the Jews are being taxed. By the way, this petition included 33 Jews from London as well, Jews from the London community. In response to this, the Board of Trade decides to really investigate the matter, and they hold these series of inquiries where they bring these witnesses to testify what the situation in Jamaica is from these former Jamaica traders. So Benjamin Bravo is a Jew who had formerly been a trader in Jamaica, who now lives in London, who testifies that that the tax in Jamaica really is contributes to their inability to function in the island. They interview this anonymous trader who had once been in Jamaica. He's a non-Jew and now in London, who makes the claim that Jews aren't paying any more than anybody else, since the Jews don't import any liquor. 5 minutes? Okay, I'm almost done. Since the Jews don't import any liquor, since the Jews are exempt from jury duty and other civic services that require a personal expense, that really the Jews, that they're not paying any more than any other naturalized citizen in Jamaica. And then one interesting one is William Wood, who, though not against the tax, he's actually for the tax. He's a former council member in Jamaica. He testifies to the board that I can truly say that all the time I lived in that island, I never heard any better reason given for taxing the Jews than that they were Jews. Finally, in 1737, the Board of Trade rules that the Jews should not be taxed as Jews, which is a somewhat definitive statement, because the Jews as Jews is definitely open to interpretation. What that means, could they be taxed as merchants or something like that? And so, just to conclude, the Board of Trade really ruled definitively in 1758 that the governors of Jamaica have no right to give any assent to decisions taken by the Assembly to tax Jews, and that was repeated in 1761, 1767, and twice more. That seems to have had effect, and there doesn't seem to be a tax in Jamaica after 1758. What's my point here is that, first of all, I think we have to be careful about the trends in Atlantic studies to overly homogenize the nation states or the borders between nation states. What's happening in Jamaica is unique. It requires local context. It requires understanding of the governance. It requires understanding of the personalities of the governors. Their mechanisms of lobbying are different than other places, and so even though the Portuguese Jewish diaspora is one that defies confessional and nation-state borders, I think we've gone too far maybe in overlooking local particularities and still trying to flesh out what's unique about a certain nation state. And maybe more importantly, I think we rely on an assumption that the colonies are always dependencies on the metropole. In the case of the the Spanish-Portuguese diaspora, this may be true in terms of ritual objects or communal authority or rabbinic authority, but in this case, we see that there isn't a bedrock reliance or dependency on on Europe. In fact, they always try to do it themselves. They only rely on Europe. Their reliance on Europe is dictated by local circumstance. When there isn't support in the colony, that's when they go to intermediaries in London. But it's not a starting point that there's always a dependency type of relationship between the colonies in Amsterdam and the colonies in London. And I think it's a much more complicated story or more nuanced story than that. So thank you very much for listening.